So I'm Richard Stopol. I'm the president and CEO of NYC Outward Bound Schools. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the topic of SEL and school reopening, a student-centered approach, which we're co-hosting with our colleagues from the Urban Assembly. And reopening schools is one of the most complex, I would say, educational and logistical challenges any of us have ever faced as educators. You know the old expression that it's not rocket science? Well, this is rocket science. Providing students with a safe and meaningful educational experience amidst the pandemic will require really a total reconceptualization of time and space and consideration of a host of factors that schools have never had to consider before. And as we think about how best to reopen schools, there's really one consideration above all that should drive our thinking and our actions, and that's how do we best meet the needs of our students, and really the full panoply of our students' needs, social and emotional, as well as academic. And as we think about how best to meet our students' needs, we at NYC Outward Bound Schools, along with our friends at the Urban Assembly, are guided and grounded in a set of, I would call, foundational beliefs that we urge you to keep in mind as well. So this includes the belief that social, emotional, and academic learning are inextricably linked, that they're not separate things, that they're complementary of and reinforcing of one another. It includes the belief that creating a sense of belonging or community should be the building block of any educational experience, and something that I think is really especially needed during this time when students are feeling such a profound sense of dislocation and loss during this pandemic. It includes a belief in the importance of centering the work around equity, of trying to ensure that every student, regardless of background and circumstance, has their full set of needs met. And it includes a belief in the importance of amplifying student voice and agency, of providing students with genuine responsibilities and genuine opportunities to contribute and shape their own educational experiences. So it's a real joy to be doing this webinar together with the Urban Assembly, an organization that shares those beliefs and that is really, like us, passionate about this idea of a student-centered approach to education. It's also a joy to know that we have such a terrific panel assembled to talk about this topic of SEL and school reopening. You'll be hearing from them momentarily, and I know that we're going to get some great perspectives and insights on this topic from our panel. And then lastly, it's a joy for me to introduce the moderator of this afternoon's panel, David Adams, the Senior Director of Strategy at Urban Assembly, who is really one of our city, and I would say our country's leading lights in the area of social and emotional learning, and someone who is a fierce advocate for an approach to education that's both asset-based and student-centered. So Dave, it's a pleasure as always to be working with you, and I'm going to turn things over to you to introduce the panel.
Richard, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And we're very excited here at the Urban Assembly to be working with Outward Bound, an organization that shares our values around the holistic development of students. And we're here today with a wonderful panel. So welcome to our audience. We are going to have a wonderful panel today on this notion of school reopening from the perspective of students. And in order to get into this panel, I'm going to do some introductions so that you guys know who are the wonderful people who are here today. So I'm going to start here with one of our own students, Dismary Santos. Dismary is a student and a senior at the Urban Assembly School for the Performing Arts. She serves as a peer group leader, as a leader for the peer group connection. And she has facilitated community building across 9th grade advisories, built strong relationships, and has been a role model and a support to the school community. She will continue her work this year during the 12th grade as a junior advisor for her school. Dismary is a focal major and part of the Epic Theater Ensemble after-school program, where she helps students to remix Shakespeare plays by rewriting scripts that align themes to real issues in their community. This year, Dismary helped remix Hamlet into a play that brought awareness to gun violence and domestic abuse, and played the role of Brenda, a new character. During this coming school year, Dismary is founding a new program called Leaders in Training. This program aims to provide students the tools and opportunities they need to become strong leaders in the school and the community. She has been selected to be a career peer at the Urban Assembly School for Performing Arts and will promote and will manage career readiness through school activities, events, and social media. She is trained in career readiness and will be in charge of facilitating the Urban Assembly's Career Month in February. And lastly, Dismary is passionate about the Theater Development Fund, a program that takes kids who would normally have access to Broadway shows to see live theater, followed by a discussion and journaling activity. Dismary Santos, welcome to our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panelist is the Honorable Mark Treyger, Chair of the Committee on Education for the City Council. Mark Treyger was the second child of Ukrainian immigrants, Noam and Tatiana, and the first member of his family born in the United States. He is the council member for the 47th District, representing the neighborhoods of Binnenhurst, Coney Island, Gravesend, and Seagate. A fluent speaker of the Russian language and a graduate of the Edward R. Murrow High School and Brooklyn College. Chairman Treyger spent 8 years teaching world history, government, and economics at New Ettrick High School. While teaching, Chairman Treyger took an active role in the United Federation of Teachers, serving as a union delegate, staff developer, and a member of the school leadership team. With a love for public service, Chairman Treyger began interning for Assemblyman William Coulton in 2001. In 2003, at age 21, Chairman Treyger became the youngest president ever of the United Progressive Democratic Club in Bensonhurst. In 2013, Chairman Treyger won a competitive Democratic primary and then received 71% of the vote in the general election to become council member of the 47th District. Upon his election, he worked with City Council Speaker Melissa Mark-Viverito in the creation of a new committee, Recovery and Resiliency, which he chaired during the 2014-2017 season, hoping to oversee the city's efforts responding to Hurricane Sandy. He also co-chaired Council's Brooklyn delegation. Since his election to the council, Chairman Treyger has led the fight to make our city more resilient and environmentally conscious in the face of climate change and extreme weather threats, helping to secure federal funding to rebuild public housing and hospitals after Sandy. He successfully advocated for the expansion of transportation options throughout the outer boroughs, investment in the maintenance and upkeep of public housing, and the upgrading and expansion of our school buildings. In 2016, Chairman Treyger was also elected as the Democratic District Leader in State Committee Men in the 46th Assembly District. Chairman Treyger joins us today, elected as the chairperson for the City Council's Committee on Education in 2018. Chairman Treyger, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It is my honor. Thank you.
Next, we're going to introduce Veronica Coleman, principal of the Kurt Hahn School, an Outward Bound school here in New York City. Veronica earned a BA in philosophy from Fordham University, having lived and studied at the Sorbonne in Paris, France, and for 2 years during her undergraduate studies. She earned an MA in Multicultural and Multilingual Studies from NYU Steinhardt School of Education in 2002, and began teaching French and English to speakers of other language in 2003. After 11 years of classroom experience, Veronica joined the Leaders in Education Apprentice Program and was appointed the principal of Kurt Hahn Expeditionary Learning School and NYC Outward Bound School in 2014. During her tenure at Kurt Hahn, Veronica has developed a school-wide approach to restorative practices, working hand in hand with EL's education core value of character development through crew and an interdisciplinary curriculum that challenges and engages and empowers young people. Principal Coleman, welcome to our panel today.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Elizabeth Strenzel, Director of Policy, New York City Department of Education. As a public servant, Elizabeth Strenzel has worked with children and families in historically underserved communities for almost 15 years, spanning pre-K through high school in charter, public, and religious school settings. She is passionately committed to ensuring that schools are safe, welcoming, and affirming places for all students. She has a heightened focus on the work of overcoming racial barriers through positive relationships and dismantling systems of oppression that are perpetrated through schools. Elizabeth currently serves as the Director of Policy at New York City Department of Education's Division of School and Climate and Wellness. She has previously served as the Director of School Culture and Climate at the Family Engagement at East Harlem Scholars Academy, and prior to that as a school psychologist, and later social and emotional learning specialist for Chicago Public Schools. In each of these roles, Elizabeth has collaborated with schools and school leaders to develop a robust multi-tier system of support centered on student social emotional development, trauma-informed care, and restorative practices. She is most proud of her role as mom to 4-year-old Mina, and she holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from James Madison University, an educational specialist degree in school psychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Elizabeth, welcome to our panel.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Look forward to discussing.
Thank you. Next, we're going to move on to Dr. Rob Jagers, Vice President of Research at CASEL. Robert J. Jagers is CASEL's Vice President of Research. Prior to joining CASEL, he was a faculty member in the Combined Education and Psychology at the University of Michigan and co-primary investigator for the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context. As the founding director of Wolverine Pathways, a university-sponsored diversity pipeline program for qualified secondary school students. Among his CASEL duties, Dr. Jagers is leading work with partner districts to explore how social and emotional learning can be leveraged to promote equitable learning environments and equitable developmental outcomes for students from historically underserved groups. He has a particular interest in participatory approaches to SEL research and practice and their implications for the civic development of children and youth. Dr. Jagers, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon. Look forward to the discussion.
And last, but certainly not least, we have Chi Kim, Chief Executive Officer of Pure Edge. Chi was named Chief Executive Officer in March 2018 after serving as the Chief Strategy and Operations Officer since 2016. Prior to joining Pure Edge, she was a California school superintendent, as well as a former school principal, teacher, leadership coach, and has served as a program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She is a co-founder at the Teaching Garden program that was adopted by the American Heart Association to help support heart health through school gardens. She is a 2018 Bahar Aspen Education Fellow, serves as the board chair and trustee at the Great Minds Board, a member of the CASEL Board of Educators, a member of the CASEL Board of Directors, and sits on the advisory council of SEL for US, Project Wayfinder, Center for Reaching and Teaching the Whole Child, and Family Code Night /MVGate. She earned her BA in Psychology and MED from UCLA, a Tier 1 Administrative Services credential from California State University, Dominguez Hills, and a Tier 2 Administrative Certification from Loyola Marymount University. She is a mom to 3 wonderful girls and resides in the greater Boston area. Chi, welcome to our panel today.
Thank you, David. And Richard, I agree. David is a leader and a light. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Chi. So speaking of leaders and lights, we have a student here, Dismary Santos. And Dismary, you are a student at one of our schools here in Manhattan, the Urban Assembly School for the Performing Arts. Our panel today is focused on this idea of school reopening and SEL from a student-centered perspective. But we don't always have the same understanding of what SEL is. The first question I have is to help our audience understand, what is social and emotional learning? And why is it important in your own life?
Social emotional learning in its true definition is just the ability to understand your emotions and other emotions, and just to understand and have empathy for others, and to know that the words that you say and the actions that you take could not only affect yourself, but other people as well. And it's really important in my life because I use it every day in my work with TGC with the freshmen. For example, one day there was a lesson and the kids were really rambunctious and didn't really want to listen. And I didn't know how to approach that because I never had an experience as a teacher. So I really had to take a moment, instead of yelling to them and forcing them to pay attention to me, I had to really understand what I'm trying to teach them with the thing of SEL, and really take a moment and understand that if I'm going to be teaching them to be aware of the things they say, I also had to apply it to that lesson that day. So I really took a moment and understood that the things that I would say would not only affect them and affect me, but the whole entire lesson. So I really used that in that day.
So it sounds like you didn't just teach the SEL skills, you embody them for the 9th graders that you were modeling for. Does that sound accurate?
Yes, because I didn't really want to seem like a hypocrite if I'm not applying the things that I'm teaching to them. So I really wanted them to know that you don't only have to use it just because I'm teaching it, it'll benefit you in the long run.
And so, speaking of benefits, the Urban Assembly School for the Performing Arts were one of the few schools in the city to really emphasize advisory and social emotional development during the remote learning from the school shutdown. Can you tell me a little bit about what it meant to have that touch base of advisory during school shutdown, and why was it important to your own social emotional and academic development?
I think with our school, the teachers and facilitators, they really have a special relationship with the students, and they knew in the beginning of all of this happening, they really wanted to maintain that relationship because they knew that for some students, school was their only escape. So I think they really wanted to maintain that connection and communication with them. So advisory was really important for me because it really made me feel like nothing really changed in that department of my relationship with the teachers. So it wasn't really a change for me because I was still connecting with them, but the difference was that it was just the screen. So it really made me feel like everything's going to be okay in the long run.
Thanks so much, Dismary. Chairman Treyger, so you heard Dismary talk about this importance of relationships, what it meant to her to have teachers prioritize the connection that they had with her. You're one actually of the few elected officials who have spent time as a teacher. As both a former teacher and in your current role as a chair of the Committee on Education, both of these roles have given you an opportunity to think deeply about the trade-offs in school reopening. Where does SEL fit in your vision of school reopening? And what are experiences like Dismary's, how do they influence the way you're thinking about your role as chairman?
Thank you, David. And Dismary gets an A+ because she is outstanding. And kudos, Dismary. And I'm learning from you right now as well, because we are lifelong learners, and I appreciate your leadership. And David, thank you for that excellent question. To all my fellow panelists who are extraordinary in their different capacities and doing this work. You know, I'm reminded by my visit before the pandemic to Leaders, which is a great outward bound school in my district. And what I remembered from that visit was the camaraderie, the strong relationship building within the crew model. And I come from a large comprehensive high school, and I'm proud of my school. I love where I taught. But you know, within the same zip code was Leaders, where they create this small learning community and the strong bonds between students and their educators. And I remember asking myself, how come we didn't learn about this within the broader system? Because they really, they knew how to establish important connections before you turn open the textbook. You know, as a teacher, you know, I had to do things before I lesson plan. For example, before you ask students to pay attention to instruction, you have to work on building trust. You have to make sure that you set positive goals and there's clear expectations, and how we have to work together to advance positive outcomes, not just for academic work, but in that social emotional lens as well, and to understand their experiences and make that relevant in the work that we're doing every single day. And if my students did not trust me, and if we didn't establish that trust and that positive relationships, it's very hard to advance anything. And so I really appreciated how Dismary kind of put that into context. And right now, as we're battling this pandemic, we hear the term, this phrase, social distancing. I'll clarify that I actually think we're in physical distancing. And the challenge that we have to overcome in this school system is how do we, reestablish and deepen connections and social connections? Because as Dismary mentioned as well, for many students, that school experience is a sanctuary. It is a safe space. I've always believed that regardless of whatever is happening in the world or in a student's life, that every student needs to feel loved, safe, supported in their school community. And they need that more than ever, because the stories I've been hearing from my colleagues and students around the city during this pandemic have been heartbreaking. And so schools like in the Outward Bound and Urban Assembly, you have been doing this work, building relationships, deepening connections prior to the pandemic. And quite frankly, the school system needs to take a couple of pages from these outstanding networks and organizations as we try to advance safe and responsible school reopening plans forward. How do we reestablish and deepen connections? How do we make sure that we are addressing the trauma that our students are experiencing right now? Trauma that has been exacerbated because it existed before the pandemic and has been blown wide open during this pandemic, and just really put students first in terms of their social, emotional needs, and establishing connections, teachers becoming case managers as well, making sure that kids have access to food and safe housing and all the support which they need. Those are the stories I'm hearing every single day. And I think that has to be front and center in every decision we make moving forward towards a safe reopening in any type of model, which we'll discuss during this panel today. Thank you, David.
Thank you. If I may follow up, Chairman Treyger, we had talked about not only this notion of supporting teachers and their support of social emotional development, but I understood that you spend a lot of time ensuring that guidance counselors, social workers, the type of infrastructure that schools support overall was protected in the budget considerations, so that students had more than one safe place to turn to in the context of reopening. Can you speak a little bit more to that reflected your values?
Yes, thank you for that. And teachers are extraordinary, but we can't do this work alone. It takes a family to advance this work. And I am a big believer in the importance of having the adequate number of social workers and counselors and other critical support staff, nurses in our school communities. And this was a very painful budget. New York City is at the bottom of the budgetary food chain. We did not really get help from Washington. We really did not get help. We actually got some cuts from the state. And there were it was a very painful situation. So that's why there's no victory lap with this budget. But one of the items that we were able to prioritize and to at least save was school budgets, fair student funding, which is a critical funding stream to keep teachers and social workers and counselors positioned and staffed in schools, and also the Single Shepherd program, which means a lot. It's not in my district, it's in Central Brooklyn and South Bronx, but I want to point out that back in March, I had the honor of being on a call with the late Principal Gary about concerns that she had for her school community, and she fought like hell for her kids and for her staff. And it's tragic, it's heartbreaking that we lost her. But when I got word that the program was in jeopardy of being cut, which would have meant in the loss of social workers and counselors in her school and many others in the South Bronx, Central Brooklyn, that became right away one of our top priorities to address. And we were able to save that Single Shepherd program to keep the social workers and counselors in the schools, because we need those relationships. The kids need them more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Treyger, and I really do, from the bottom of my heart, appreciate what it meant that you invoked the memory of Principal Gary, who was a principal for our Urban Assembly School in the Bronx Academy of Letters, who's recently passed away. So thank you very much for invoking her memory in this discussion today. So speaking of what it means to be a principal, Veronica, you are a principal of the Kurt Hahn School. The Urban Assembly and New York City Outward Bound have prioritized the idea of character development and social emotional learning as a core aspect of what it means to be educated. How has the Kurt Hahn School lived these ideas and these ideals through the context of virtual learning and school reopening? Principal Coleman.
Thank you so much for that question. And I just want to take a moment to echo Councilmember Treyger and say thank you so much to Dismary just for benefiting from all the hard work that we put into to advisory. And also Councilmember Treyger, I just want to say it feels really great to have our elected officials understand the work that we're doing, because they're doing it recently in a little screen in a little box, and sometimes it can really feel like you're in your own small world and no one is noticing what's happening. So it feels really wonderful that this panel is happening. I see 189 participants, so that's really fantastic. And what I can say is really an echoing of a lot of what I've heard already, which is that we spent a lot of time building relationships with young people before the pandemic happened. And as February, the kind of the news was indicating that something was going to be happening, we had already started giving laptops out to our seniors, thinking that they were the ones who were going to be most in need of those laptops. Little did we know that that was going to become a citywide event to try and get technology out to everyone. But we put our crew teachers as case managers for every single one of our students just from day one. And they were the ones who had all the contact information. If the contact information wasn't available in ATS, you could bet that a crew teacher knew how to get a hold of a parent, how to get a hold of a student, how to reach, if a phone got disconnected, how to reach a student through another student. And so it just made it such that we were able to learn what impact this was having on our students. Our school is in East Flatbush. I was calling it the epicenter of the epicenter by April because we really saw, as a school that has pretty much 100% Black and Brown students, we really saw the impact that coronavirus has had on our community and the disproportionality therein. And the phone calls that we received, the news that we would share in our daily morning circle as a staff, just around the students that needed our support because they had a family member who was sick. We had 6 young people lose a parent by May. We had over 20 students lose a close relative, an aunt, a grandmother. It was very, very, very devastating. And that crew, those crew relationships and the teacher-student relationships that we had built before the pandemic happened became the cornerstone of the work that we did going forward. And it was the primacy of outreach. It was outreach, outreach, outreach every day. The work that we were doing academically was important, but was not nearly as important as making sure that we didn't lose track of any students, that we knew what was happening with our students, what kind of support they needed, what kind of support their family needed, reaching out to a parent when there was a loss in the family and just reassuring them that we were not going to let their young person fail the semester because of this hardship. It was just a full team effort. And I would say that, we shifted our whole sort of academic approach to a much deeper, more project-based, more interdisciplinary, even more than we had done in the past approach. And it really was an opportunity for us as a staff to come together and to think creatively about what is it that young people want to be learning about right now in the midst of a pandemic. And in the midst, after George Floyd was murdered, in the midst of an uprising. And we made sure that we did not waste young people's time with anything that was not going to be empowering to them in that context.
Thank you, Principal Coleman. I mean, it sounds like your focus was on developing relationships and then using those relationships to build the type of trust that facilitates learning. So I heard you talk about project-based learning. I heard you talk about outreach. I know in our own schools, all of our teachers became experts in Instagram, TikTok, Flipgrid, right? Making sure that we're getting to our students where they're at rather than forcing our students to come to us. So it sounds like that notion of relationships and trust were a foundation. Can you tell me a little bit more about how that idea is now translating in the context of planning for school reopening?
Absolutely. And I would say that it starts with the adults in the building. And so we've had to spend a lot of time through the pandemic and before building community as adults first, so that we have the model that we can use to build community with young people, and that we're there to support each other, because just to be frank, like, this was a very trauma-inducing situation for everyone involved, young people for sure, but adults have absolutely, and I think this was reflected in some of the learning that took place this summer with principals, that principals, experience trauma, staff and teachers experience trauma. So just thinking through, how we could focus on building some relationships amongst ourselves, and then how we would translate that into just supporting and helping young people to get through this time. And then to really think about if we're going to support each other emotionally, we can also support each other academically. We can also support each other with vertical planning. We can support each other with interdisciplinary projects. We can co-plan together on a daily basis so that we can support the same group of students with projects that are aligned, so that they have less to worry about, but they can go deeper and think more critically. And so to really have staff members and teachers be able to rely on each other, they have to trust each other. And when they have those strong relationships, then they can support students just in a more cohesive way. I think when a student walks and this time they may not be walking from anywhere to anywhere, but when they're experiencing one class and another class, and they see that the teachers have been communicating, and they see that guiding questions are aligned, and they see that ideas are building upon other ideas, I think they feel that they are being well cared for because they're being well planned for. And I think that that's going to be our approach for September.
A student who is well cared for because they have been well planned for. I really appreciate that. And so Elizabeth, you heard Principal Coleman here talk about how she's translated the notion of relationships and communities, not only to the context of social emotional development, but also into the academic development for young people. Given your responsibility for policy across the city in the Division of School Climate and Wellness, what SEL practices have you seen risen up as really effective? And how has the NYC Department of Education operationalized those practices into policy?
Thank you, David, for that question, and for the panelists thus far for their contributions. I'm here representing our division and Deputy Chancellor Robinson, and she wanted to make sure that I give a public shout out to Councilmember Trager before we start, who's been a huge supporter of our work and just a longtime champion and advocate. And if I know her, she's watching and cheering me on and listening, and so she's going to want to make sure I got that in. So warm welcome to you, and also David and everyone else here. Really happy to be here on behalf of the division. I think that actually a lot of what people have shared thus far reflect practices that we know are effective and practices that we've embedded in policy. So as a system, we've partnered with a lot of different programs and vendors that I'll talk about, some of our more successful partnerships, but rather than any particular like program or structure, it's the things that are baked into that we have found to really be successful, and that's what I want to elevate a few of those here. So the first is relationships. Everyone on the panel has talked about that in some form or another, and practices that center relationships are what we see as the most powerful levers for social and emotional learning. We see SEL as human work and the work of humanity, and there's just no context to do that work without an anchoring in relationships. And so Dismary talked a lot about this in terms of advisory. Principal Coleman and Councilmember Treyger talked about this. So as far as practices as a system, like we've partnered to expand our work with Sanford Harmony and Ruler and restorative practices, all because they have mechanisms to center relationships. And so things like advisory, a meetup or a buddy up, a morning meeting, like regardless of the program that schools choose, I think I'm offering this a little bit because I think sometimes schools think about, well, I got to get this program, I got to do this SEL thing for these 20 minutes of the day. And really, there are a lot of great resources and programs out there. I think the key practice to hone in on is how are you using that as a lever to build relationships? I think a second key idea for us or key practice for us is SEL academic integration, which is some of what you were asking about and what Principal Coleman was talking about. So in addition to the value of just explicitly teaching SEL for SEL's sake, we see the most effective practices and programs as ones that can be then embedded into core academic instruction as well. So if you're using a circle model through advisory, for example, and in that circle, you're building self-awareness, you're elevating student voice, you're honoring lived experiences, how can you then take some of those practices from your more standalone SEL programming and embed those into core instruction? So for example, are you using discussion and debate? Are you using teaming? Are you using project-based learning? How are you having that SEL work live through every single thing that you do? That's really the practice where we see a lot of positive impact. The Morningside Center, for example, is one of our lead partners for RJ work, and therefore ours curriculum does SEL through literacy. So there are a lot of different ways that principals can be innovative about this and schools can be innovative, but I think for us, we see practices that embed SEL into core instruction as being really effective. And then a third one for us, sorry, there's some flying around my apartment. The third practice for us related to SEL has to do with anti-racism and the work of inclusivity and belonging. So if SEL practices are not addressing racial equity and racial trauma, they're not doing the job. Students and educators should be able to bring their full selves into the school building and into the spaces that they're in and be affirmed for exactly who they are and for how they show up. And so as schools are thinking about reopening, we're not just coming back on the heels of the COVID pandemic, we're coming back on the heels of recent attention on longstanding racial injustice and a lot of social unrest. And so practices that allow space for that and that honor that experience need to be at the forefront. And this, as it relates to policy, I think we have a slide actually to show the supportive environment framework, which is a resource that the DOE created. This is intended to communicate our values and our vision for social emotional learning and wellness in a supportive environment and to offer strategies. And so if you'll notice that it's organized into 4 key domains. For our schools, we've really unpacked like, what does it mean to create a supportive environment? What does that look like for adults and for students? And what are the resources within each of those domains so that I can practice this in my school? And so although social and emotional learning and SEL academic integration are called out in that physical and mental wellness domain, SEL lives throughout the whole document. SEL is central to relationships, it's central to restorative work, it's central to equity and student voice work. And so at a policy level, what we tried to do was school districts have different things that they call it or different documents, but whatever your goal setting process is, or like the comprehensive education plan or your school planning tool, we built that framework in as a policy or as a requirement within our goal setting process. So all schools in the DOE are required to select one of those 4 areas of concentration when they do their annual goal setting. As schools think about reopening, I would think about how are you embedding SEL into whatever goal setting or process tools you're using. And just some related policies in our office that have promoted the expansion of SEL are like the discipline code. We made significant revisions to the discipline code to promote SEL skill building and to limit the use of punitive discipline. We've expanded our health education instruction, which includes explicit teaching of SEL, and also thought about targeted supports for high need schools. So pairing of school response clinicians who are crisis social workers and mental health professionals with schools that are investing in restorative practices so that these schools have like a foundational supportive response at their tier 1 or their universal support, and then they have access to layered mental health services on top of that. So those are some of the policy decisions that we've been able to make that for us are really anchored in those 3 core practices that I talked about: relationships, SEL academic integration, and anti-racism.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We appreciate the depth of thinking that has gone into supporting schools with policies and structures that can prioritize social and emotional learning in this time of reopening. Dr. Jagers, you are the Vice President of Research at CASEL. And CASEL recently released a report talking about Reunite, Renew, and Thrive, an SEL roadmap for reopening schools. And this report emphasizes 4 critical practices. First, it talks about taking time to cultivate and deepen relationships, build partnerships, and plan for SEL. And you've heard that throughout the panel of different organizations who have prioritized relationships and the work that partnerships have done in order to support that. You'll also talk about designing opportunities where adults can connect, heal, and build their capacity to support students. Principal Coleman spent some time thinking about what it means to develop the adult community. The third thing you guys recommend is create safe, supporting, and equitable learning environments that promote all students' social and emotional development. So Elizabeth talked a little bit about how we address the discipline code. What does it mean to create restorative practices and opportunities for students to have equitable discipline policies? And then lastly, this ability to use data as an opportunity to share power, deepen relationships, and continuously improve support for students. So as a research director, what is the research and evidence telling you about highlighting these 4 policies and practices? And what can schools expect if they put your practices into life?
So thank you very much for the question. And it's a pleasure to follow my colleagues, because I think much of what has been outlined is actually supported by the literature. The research literature that the field of social and emotional learning is predicated on is randomized controlled trials, large-scale studies that looked at social and emotional learning programs that were implemented with high quality, and we were able, and that literature begins to demonstrate the positive impacts on young people who are actively engaged in those programs. And so relationship-related skills to include the capacity to identify one's own emotions and emotions of others, relationship building skills, ability to cooperate, share, etc., all increase in the context of these high quality programs. And then the link to academic outcomes was also established in that literature. And so that provides us with a basis from which to further develop and better nuance how these programs and practices are actually implemented in the variety of schools in which our students participate. We're paying particular attention in our work to issues of equity because while it has been demonstrated that social emotional learning programs enhance outcomes for young people furthest from opportunity, the degree to which that is true and how it's made true is less clear. And so, we're paying a lot of attention to that. And of course, the focus on relationships and the entire field is, predicated on all kinds of literatures. And you can think about the research on the absence of relationships. And those would be things around separation and exclusion and discrimination and bullying and the like. And those kinds of negative relationships or absence of healthy, positive relationships have negative outcomes on both individual as well as collective development. Those contexts set up lower functioning in individuals, but also make the climate less inviting and more toxic for everyone involved. And you can think about bystander literature and all of that as well. On the other side of that, there's an abundance of literature on attachment, both in the context of family and in schools, teacher-student relationship, peer relationships, school engagement and belonging literature. And then our colleagues talked about the variety of programmatic efforts that can be put in place, the types of practices like community building in the context of social emotional learning. Advisory was discussed. cohort models, academies, et cetera, all are intended to cultivate strong relationships, both adult student as well as student to student. And those are seen as more healthy and robust contexts for learning. Project-based learning, culturally responsive pedagogy, service learning, youth participatory action research, all center on the notion of young people's lived experience as being the foundations upon which the educational content can be structured and scaffolded so that they're affirmed and perceived as experts of their own lived experience and supported in figuring out the applications of academic material, which leads to enhanced engagement, stronger relationships, better school climate, more robust schools. And, you know, the same as these kinds of issues are also germane to educators who are also human beings who have themselves gone through stresses and traumas and themselves need relationships, and that was alluded to as well. And so you could point to the literature on teacher collective efficacy, meaning places where teachers believe that they together can improve the quality of the educational experience for young people, in fact, are better contexts for young people. And in order to establish that, there's got to be strong relationships among educators.
It's almost as if, Dr. Jagers, what you're telling us is that our planning for school reopening should be our planning for schools in general. One that centers and prioritizes the social and emotional development of staff and students in service of learning, as well as community building.
Well, yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. It is the case also that school communities where relationships were stronger pre-dual pandemic have students who continue to thrive based on those relationships. So it is absolutely the case that the preference would be healthy, strong relationships for all young people and adults, and those are places where we all thrive.
Thank you, Dr. Jagers. Chief, speaking of relationships, I feel like we're doing pretty good, you and me, in that context. And I'm really excited to have you on our panel today. As the CEO of PureEdge, you could think about funding anything. Can you tell me a little about the journey that has helped you to prioritize social emotional learning as one of the key areas of funding for your organization?
Yeah, thanks for that question, David. I just begin my background, so it's sort of entry into the philanthropic space. But just knowing what schools are like as a teacher, a principal, and a superintendent, and kind of going through just my own lived experience in the system, and really thinking about what is it that kind of creates these magical schools or classrooms, right? We've all done tons of classroom visits, and you can feel the magic when you walk into a place that is just on fire, right? You can just feel it when you walk into the room. The kids are engaged, the teacher's there and present. You can also feel that other angst, like that feeling when you go into a room, you're like, whew, it is chaos. And, you know, just knowing what that visceral response is, and knowing what that really means for human contact and how human beings enter into spaces. Right now, our shift and our focus, the reason why we care about SEL so much and why we invest in it is because we care about the human experience, right? And when we think about SEL, we don't really think of it as a program necessarily. We're a private operating foundation, so we actually have free resources and free PD and all those for school-based pieces. But on the other side of our house, we're actually a grant maker that is investing in national organizations that have been at the work for a while to really support and do the research and get best practices out into the space. And so we are one of the funders for CASTLE and their CSI work. And we specifically focused on SEL because we don't believe that it is an add-on of any kind, but when we do it really well, what we're really trying to do is build up the human capacity for understanding. How I show up into a space and how we all show up into even this panel. We're living right now in a society that is hugely dependent on every human being doing the right thing for the common good. And when we all are collectively thinking about the common good, we probably could get out of this mess that we're in, but because we're not actually utilizing all of our SEL skills, right? Being able to know how I come into a space, know how I interact with my peers, have relationships, how we problem solve together. It's that central focus of how we're living right now, whether it's in schools or in community, that sort of drives us to continue that SEL is probably one of the most important skills. I was talking to someone this afternoon, and they really said, schools are all, they're content based. It's a content driven system. And when you get out into the real world, it's not a content driven system. It's actually a system built for relationships. Like, how do you navigate? It's your SEL skills that are really going to help you navigate where you actually go after schooling, and the way we're preparing ourselves for, reopening. For us as an organization, we are focused primarily on the adults. I am so concerned about the mental health supports of the educators in the systems. Our team has been working pretty hard and robustly, just trying to get as many self-care supports out into the space as possible. I'm worried because, when we don't have strong SEL skills, David, and the reason why we focus on that is that we need a coherent system of SEL as well, right? When there's coherence in the systems, communications can be much more aligned. And right now, the reason why there's so much chaos, I believe, is because coherence doesn't exist in our systems right now, from the feds to the states to local to down to the districts. And people's basic needs need to get met before we can actually go into any other higher level thinking skills, right? But we do wholeheartedly invest in SEL because we do believe that that's what's going to help our communities grow, not just for schools, but for career pathways as well. And so our next investment is really trying to integrate not just the state level work through CASEL, but also looking at career pathways and sort of what work will look like. We know from the World Economic Forum and all of the information we're getting back is it's not content. Businesses will actually teach the skills. What they want are young people, folks that are ready to be able to solve problems together, to be able to get along, and to really be able to develop some of those challenging things. That's why I'm so excited about just the project-based learning that you all have shared today as well. And one thing that I do want to just shout out to Principal Coleman, I believe that you are creating a system that you would have your own children attend if possible. I feel like any educator who actually teaches, leads, or is in a place where they would want their own child to attend, or their own grandchildren or family members to attend, I believe that those are the best drivers, and knowing that there's some kind of internal motivation to create a system that is just great for all kids. But if you're willing to do that and have your own family attend the school in which you serve, I think that's one of those pieces where I just feel like I want my kid to go to your school. I think those are the kinds of magic pieces that policy, when it's done really well, investments done really well in public and private partnerships, can really start to foster that kind of community practice where SEL is just sort of a given and not a programmatic plug-in, but really this is how we operate from day to day, how we interact as human beings. One of my favorite people, Terry Lawler, who works for the Department of Ed in Delaware, she says, you got to build relationships before you need the relationships. And I think, David, you spoke to that earlier as well about how all these schools that had these incredible relationships just continued on. And there are teachers right now that feel terrible guilt because they have not been able to find their kids. And many of them are struggling with the fact that they didn't have these strong relationships prior to the pandemic. And so trying to build that after has been a real challenge. So as we start to think about reopening schools, what kinds of mechanisms can we put into place to just build those relationships? So for us, we invest in SEL because we want humanity to become more human.
Thank you so much, G. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go through a rapid fire question and answering from our audience. What we're going to do is I'm going to direct a question, and if our panelists wouldn't mind trying to answer this question in under 30 seconds so that we can get back to Dismary and she can close us out for the day. So the first question I'm going to send over is going to be to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, is there a place on the DOE website that talks about the supportive learning environment framework that you put forth in the context of social and emotional learning? In 30 seconds, please.
Yes, you can find it on We Teach by searching Supportive Environment Framework.
folks, Elizabeth has now set the standard for our question and answer response time. So thank you for your brevity on that. Chairman Trager, with regard to understanding the staffing models in the public education schools in New York City Department of Education, Susan Tillman is asking, in order to maintain or even heighten SEL supports as schools reopen, what is being considered by the city in terms of different staffing models at the school level so both teachers and students can get the support that they need?
This is an unfair structure for politicians to answer in under 30 seconds, but I'm going to try very, very hard. So I think that's an important question because you need staff to do this work. What I'll tell you right now is that I know that educators are going through a process. Those who are seeking medical accommodations, that's all being evaluated right now to see who will be granted that. This is a very serious issue, both involving health of staff, health of school communities. But of course, you need staffing to make this work. You know, first of all, there are rules around this, but it's also the right thing to do to make sure that we have adequate staffing, both from education, counselors, social workers, other types of support staff to make schools work. So this is still a pending item that has not been resolved.
Thank you so much, Chairman Trager. And lastly, I'm going to go to Dr. Jagers, please. This is from Lauren Horsakoff in under 30 seconds. When you talk about the effectiveness of SEL, are you measuring it in terms of school-defined goals or values that students themselves want to bring to learning, work, and relationships? Would you just give a brief overview of the concept of assessment in SEL, Dr. Jagers, for our panel, for our audience member, Lauren Horsakoff?
Yes. I think historically, we've looked at school compiled data as being important, as an array of important outcomes, because a lot of this work obviously occurs in school settings. And so the degree to which it's valued and helps schools meet their accountability goals is important. However, I think increasingly we're beginning to look at student experiences as the cornerstone of the work we do to ensure that young people experience this work as relevant, meaningful, and propelling them towards the kinds of developmental outcomes that they and their communities are interested in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jagers. And as we move now to our final question, this comes to Dismary Santos, our student from the Urban Assembly School for Performing Arts, who opened us up. And Dismary, this is a question with regard to the future of our nation and our communities. I want you to imagine that every student who graduated from high school has the social emotional skills that you do, who believes in the social emotional outcomes that you believe in. How would your schools be different? How would our schools, how would our communities, and how would our neighborhoods be different if we all had that idea?
I feel like, as it was said before, that there's a lot of chaos due because there isn't a lot of coherence between others. So I feel like if everybody has the same skills, then there will be less chaos. Like, for example, the math, like, I understand that people are very not taking into consideration of others. So I feel like if they have the SEL skills, they would understand that with not wearing a mask, it won't only affect them, it would affect others. So I just think that it would just be a more positive place and other people would just be more understanding of others.
Thank you, Dismary, and I appreciate your Wi-Fi holding out into your last comment. Dismary Santos, Chi Kim, Chairman Treyger, Principal Coleman, Elizabeth Strenzel, Dr. Jagers, Richard Stopol, thank you for joining us today in our panel around SEL and school reopening. To our audience members, we hope that we've given you an opportunity to consider the importance of social emotional learning in your school reopening plans. To our panelists, thank you for continued commitment and how Chi says, letting us be the humans that we are. I look forward to continuing to have this conversation in the future. And on behalf of the Urban Assembly and the Outward Bound